Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode here on penetration testing with Kali Linux. And today, guys, we are jumping into all things Metasploit. And this is going to be one of my most favorite areas and things within Kali Linux to jump in, to digress, to dissect, and to have some really fun going into all things exploitation, post-exploitation, scanning, enumeration, you have it. So what is Metasploit? And in a nutshell, what Metasploit is the operating system of hacking. So think of it like, Windows, and then you have all these programs, and then you've got the shell. Um, it's essentially that operating system that allows us to attack, to compromise, and create that reverse shell for us then to interact with a certain host. So in a nutshell, and to go over the Metasploit basics right now, we're going to first spend, I guess, the next 10 to 15 minutes just doing a bit of a whiteboard lesson. So this is critical and fundamental before we get into the command line and running these exploits. It's imperative that you do understand some of the concepts and methodologies and the approach that Metasploit has once we get access to a certain host, how we do that, and some of the foundations that Metasploit has pre-built for us in order for us to go ahead and actually do those. So when we talk about Metasploit, there's usually two things that Metasploit does for us. It's there to identify and validate those systems for us. So we want to fingerprint, we want to identify, we want to enumerate, we want to gain access to a certain host or a certain system. And Metasploit framework is the go-to resource for us to do that. And it's a collection of databases, and we'll talk about it in more depth as we continue to go on. It's a collection of databases that allows us to, load up modules, and then based on the action that we want to do, whether it's a scanning module or whether it's a post-exploitation module, once we have access to a host, what are we then able to do? It gets very granular, and it's very easy to chop and change, and it's very customizable to our liking. So when we talk about Metasploit, there's two basic areas of that. One is to identify the system, the vulnerabilities inside that system, and then to obviously exploit those vulnerabilities, to identify the vulnerability, to then leverage those vulnerabilities within that particular system, and then to exploit them, to break them essentially. And then there's tons and tons of exploits within Metasploit. And once we have access to a certain system, we then can start pivoting away from that system and start looking and leveraging other systems within that ecosystem of network or that organization that we've compromised. So here's the sort of the holistic view of Metasploit, and I created this for you guys because it's a visual and it just works when I'm explaining what it does and how it works. So as I said before, it's the operating system of hacking, right? And I'm just gonna get my pen out so we can draw this together. And what we're gonna do right now is we're gonna start here on the left-hand side. So we're gonna look at the terms, and then we're gonna work our way all the way around to talk about Armitage as well. So I'll just clear the screen. And let's just start off with a little bit of terms. So you're going to hear quite a few terms when you're dealing with Metasploit. You're going to hear exploits, you're going to hear payloads, you're going to hear modules. So let's cover what they are, and then we'll move over to the right-hand side of the screen as we continue to go around. So some terms that you want to be familiar with is obviously exploit. And an exploit is what we just mentioned, right? It's an exploitation of a vulnerable system. It's leveraging a vulnerability within a system. So if we're scanning against a certain protocol like SSH or FTP or SMB or NetBIOS or a protocol like, whatever that case is, right? So whatever protocol that we're scanning against, if we notify or if we see a vulnerability within that. So if we are enumerating for SSH, and we might do some digging around, do some research, and then we find that that specific version of SSH is vulnerable to a remote code execution, we then can leverage that to exploit that host or exploit that protocol and gain access to an SSH service on the other end. So an exploit is just obviously leveraging a vulnerability. A payload, on the other hand, a payload has, it's basically a piece of code that runs. And then we'll talk about payloads in the next slide when we go into the Metasploit framework foundations and into the core of modules and what they are and how they work. But a payload is essentially a piece of code that runs with two sort of areas. One, it can be user directed. So a user can then go ahead and run that. So a user, So we can send a user a specific link. They can go to that website, download a certain application like an exe or another program file, and then they can run that, and then that can cause a payload to run on that machine, interact with our Metasploit session, and then we get a session. So we get an actual shell to that host. Or then it can be an executable. So when we're creating payloads within Metasploit, we can create an executable payload, and then we can, direct it and do what we want to do with it within that Meterpreter session that we have access to. And that's essentially it. So a payload is a piece of code that runs. It runs both on the host, and then we have the Meterpreter session as well that's listening, and then that's how that session gets interacted with us. And then we've got modules. So when we talk about Metasploit, there's 4 main modules that it has, and we're going to cover them in the next video, not just yet. So it's very modular based. So any sort of module that we want to do, whether it's a scanning module, whether it's a post-exploitation, whether it's a compromise, whether it's, those 4 areas of modules that Metasploit has and does very well, we can load up that specific module and then go ahead and consume our testing that way. So that's essentially the term side of things. So we've got the exploits, the payloads, and the modules. Now, I know there's been some issues getting Metasploit to work, and I've put in this sort of get it working part. We're not going to go through that in this video, but this was just an issue that I had setting it up, and I should have recorded this to show you how to go about that. What we've done was, I've purged the actual Metasploit. So Metasploit by default, Metasploit comes with Kali Linux by default. But if it doesn't, if you've got another Ubuntu version or another software version that you have, you can actually go ahead and install it. So there's been some issues between Armitage, getting Armitage running, which is the graphical user interface. And we'll talk about Armitage in just a few minutes. It's very, very powerful and a great tool. But usually there's some communication database issues between Armitage and Metasploit. So, when you're launching Armitage, it might come up saying, hey, there's an error, I can't connect to this database.yml file. And then your mind goes into this, it doesn't work. And what else do I need to do? And, you read all these things on the internet and some of them are wrong. And one thing does another thing, and then it breaks this other database. And there's just a lot of issues that can go wrong with Armitage and Metasploit framework. So what I wanted to do is put a little bit of a foundation there for you guys to set it up correctly. And to give you the option to also notify me and let me know if you've encountered any issues setting this up. So if you have encountered some issues, let me know what they are, and I'm more than happy to walk you through how to fix them up and get Armitage and Metasploit running. So this is what I did. So I purged the Metasploit framework. So I got rid of all the data. I then did a remove recursive force. So what that does is basically remove all those files within the opt Metasploit file. So within Linux, you have the /opt folder, and the /opt folder is just anything that's a third-party software. People put it usually in that opt folder. We're not going to go into the file structure discussion right now. I think we'll cover that in another video around Linux. But all you did was just remove TAC-RF, which is the recursive force. So any errors that come up, it'll just force past them. We don't care about that, and then it'll remove everything in that /opt/Metasploit directory. So I removed that. I did an apt-get update with a fresh update. And then I went ahead and installed Metasploit again, and then everything was working fine. So we'll cover it in the command line together, but I'm not going to go ahead and do it because I spent a few hours trying to get it to work. So I'm not going to go ahead and do that again and break it. So if you do encounter any issues setting Metasploit up, I'm more than happy for you to reach out to me and let me know if you've got any concerns or issues. So from here, we've got a couple of options to run. So we actually have 4 key areas around Metasploit, right? We've got the framework itself, which is, the MSF console, which is where we're going to live most of the time. And this is the command line interface with Metasploit. And then we've got these 3 areas. We have the community, we have the Express, and the Pro. These 2 down here are paid versions. And these are obviously commercial grade products. And the only difference between the commercial based appliances, so between these 2 services, is basically more added functionality. You've got things like one-click foundations that have been built in. It's graphical, and it's just it interacts and sort of interlinks better with other system services and modules that Metasploit creates. So that's the only difference with it. The framework itself is the command line. So these two, so this is basically the command line interface. These are all GUI based. And then we're going to live right here with the framework. So we're going to launch MSF console, and then we're going to live inside that MSF console session. And then we're going to look at Armitage. So Armitage is the GUI. And what Armitage does is a really cool product that's been created by a guy called Raphael Marge. So a big shout out to Raphael. And Raphael has designed Armitage for pen testers. And what it does is it's designed to bring the graphical sense, but also the collaboration within Metasploit. So you'll see as we're working with Metasploit, and I think one of the biggest challenges with Metasploit that we're going to cover as well in the next slides is collaboration, right? So if you're working on a red team engagement, you want to collaborate with different systems, different users, different people when you're coming up against an exploit. So you can see that when we're working with the MSF console in the command line, it gets very clunky in terms of, and you'll see what I mean when we do the demo and stuff, but it gets to a point where you can't collaborate very effectively as you could in Armitage. So we're going to take a look at all that. And then we're going to go from there as well. So that's essentially, guys, so they're the terms that we've discussed, getting started, the options. So we've got the main Metasploit framework. We have the community edition. Both of those are free. So these two versions here are free. And then we have the Express and Pro. Those two are both paid commercial products. And then we've got Armitage. So we're going to look at Armitage as well. So in the demo, what we're going to do is we're going to fire up Metasploit framework. So we're going to launch MSF console. We're going to take a look around in there, and then we're going to jump into Armitage. And you'll see how amazing Armitage has been created, and you know the cool things that you can do within Armitage, which allows it to be one of the most effective and really cool red teaming penetration testing frameworks that have been built. And it's just a great collaboration tool that's been made by Raphael Marge. You guys are more than happy to go Google, YouTube Raphael and look at it, all his amazing work that he's done. A big shout out and give thanks to Raphael. So let's jump into a bit of the modules now. So this is one of the areas that I wanted to spend around a couple of minutes just talking about, because it's imperative that you understand, I guess, some of the modules that exist within Metasploit framework. So what they all do, how they all sort of interact, and I guess where do we go from here? So let me just get my pen ready so we can just cover this together. So over here you have, so let's start on the left-hand side. So let's look at the auxiliary modules. So there's 4 main modules within Metasploit. You have auxiliary, you've got your exploitation modules, you've got payload modules, and then you have your post modules. And there's also another one called NOPS. We're not going to cover NOPS, but we'll check it out later when we log into the command line and look at a few things. So the 4 main areas is auxiliary. So if we start to the left-hand side here at the auxiliary module, and the auxiliary module is basically something like scanning, discovery, you can do denial of service attacks, and in some cases you can also bypass authentication. So auxiliary and exploits can also do the same thing. An auxiliary module can be an exploit module if it tends to be, if you're coming up against a vulnerable host that, let's say, for example, we are using SSH as a sort of protocol that we want to exploit. And let's say that we do know what those credentials are, we can then cause a remote code execution. We can have a full shell over SSH to that compromised victim. So the auxiliary module is designed to do a couple of things. One is to discover what's running on that system. So we want to enumerate and discover those ports, those services that are running, and that's what those auxiliary modules are intended to do. We can also obviously do denial of service and bypass authentication as well in some cases. The exploit module is essentially that, like what we've discussed before. So it's there to give us remote code execution. It's to compromise that host and then gain access to that host. So it's there to create, obviously, payloads, and that's what we do. So we'll jump over to payloads. And payloads has, there's multiple payloads that we can run within Metasploit. 2 of the most common ones are executable payloads and interactive payloads. So the executable payload is for us to communicate within Metasploit framework that certain command. So we can create a payload, and then we can interact and create an executable payload within that certain payload framework. But then the most important one is the interactive payloads. And these are really cool because essentially when we talk about payloads, there's two foundations of a payload. One is the piece of payload that runs on the host. So the malicious payload that runs on that vulnerable system or that host system. And then we've also got that reversed handler slash listener that listens for that payload. So when we create a payload, there's two versions of that payload. So you can create like a payload with MSF Venom, for example. You put a listener on there that listens back to our Metasploit framework. And then when these two start talking, you essentially get this session that we can then interact with. So the piece of payload that runs, you've got the handler that listens, and then a session gets established within these two, and then we can then interact with that session. So a session is basically a compromised host that we can then interact with it and then start doing my favorite down here, this post-exploitation modules. And from here, we can start interacting and start requesting post things that we can then ask that system for, such as, shell. So we've got a shell essentially. So we can start going from a lateral move from here. So we can start asking other systems, hey, what other network services are running? We can use things like CrackMap exec, which can then leverage other systems using SMBs that start using credentials to gain access to other shares and file systems within the network. So the post module is basically post-exploitation. It's what we can do after we have compromised the host. And then what are the amazing things that we can do from there, such as dumping credentials, getting the Etsy shadow file, password files, dumping those creds, getting all the hashes, breaking those hashes, and then start leveraging more post-exploitation like foundations. So that's the modules in a nutshell. And I really wanted to cover those with you because they were imperative that you sort of understood what they all are, how they all come together, and how they work. So MSF console, like I said before, has some challenges. And when you're working with the MSF framework, inside the specific console itself, there's just a few caveats, right? When you've got the console and you're interacting with a certain host, it gets very clunky in terms of, I have a host here, and it's usually great if it's one-to-one. So if I've got the attacker machine here, and I have the host over here that we want to compromise, slash the victim, that's fantastic. So if I've got a one-to-one relationship with the attacker machine and the host, that's great. I can interact with it, put in all my payloads in here, send those across, get a reverse shell, that's great. But what happens now when you have 10 different hosts, right? Or 50 different hosts that you've now scanning and got access to. And so the issue with Metasploit framework is it gets really hard to keep track of all those hosts. So if I'm in a specific host and I'm working with this host, and then I've also got a shell now with this host and another shell with that host, I've got to keep exiting my session. I've got to go back into the background and then start, and then you start losing which session that you have open with. So it gets to the point where it doesn't collaborate and doesn't communicate very well with, multiple systems. And then you've got users as well. So if I'm doing a red team with, 5 different users or 5 different people in that team, I then want to collaborate with those people to then, let them know where I'm at in terms of my staging payloads, what systems are compromised, what steps have I done then to continue in that, post-exploitation module if we're working in. You can't do that effectively within Metasploit framework. So what Army Teach then does, when we talk about Army Teach, it brings it into this amazing graphical user interface that allows us to then collaborate really, really effectively within Metasploit. So it's an amazing tool that you can then leverage, and we're going to look at it together. We're going to fire up Army Teach. You'll see the graphical sense of how it works, and then just the amazing foundation that has been built by Raphael to help us as pen testers and red teamers to do amazing things. So that's some of the challenges within Metasploit framework, and it's probably going to sound a little bit vague and a little bit over your head right now, but you'll see what I mean once we do the demo of some things that we're going to a bit later. All right, guys, so that's pretty much it. We've covered the Metasploit framework foundations, the basics. So we've talked about, everything from Metasploit to the payloads, how they work, the exploits, some of the terms, payload, exploit, modules. You're familiar with those concepts. Now let's jump into the practical side of things and do some amazing practical exploits. I'll see you guys very soon.